opening session of the 11th annual meeting of the Valdai Discussion Club stands to order, and it is called The Limits of Governability or Systemic Failure. And today, among the participants, we see Igor Ivanov, former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Secretary of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, Thierry Mariani, Deputy of the National Assembly in the 11th arrondissement, and Mr. Kuzminov, Director of the R&D Institute of the Higher School of Economics, Mr. Masahiro Akiyama, Anatoly Turkunov from the Institute of International Relations, Ivan Krastev from Liberal Strategies Institute in Sofia, and Mr. Lukyanov, Editor-in-Chief of Russia in Global Politics magazine. And me, Andrew Bystritsky, I'm actually will be the chairman of the Valdai Foundation. Before I pass the floor to Mr. Ivanov, I would like to say a few words about what we discussed yesterday. Our Valdai Club is undergoing certain changes, certain transformations. We are moving forward, making certain progress, and I hope very much that eventually we'll transform into a think tank, an organization which will do a high-quality analysis and which will pass for the judgment of the public opinion certain propositions as to how certain international problems might be resolved. Today, the Valdai Club invited new intellectual sponsors, new co-founders. Among them, we see the Institute of Foreign Affairs, the Council on the External Defense Policy, and the Council of Foreign Affairs and the Higher School of Economics. Let us start with the presentations by the heads of the board of the Valdai Foundation, and I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Ivanov, who is president of the Russian Association on the International Affairs. This is one of the four organizations which form the core of the Valdai Foundation. Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to welcome all the participants in our today's meeting on behalf of the Russian Council on International Affairs. The Valdai Club has a very solid and strong image among the experts and in the expert community. It has proved to be a good platform for the discussion of the international and domestic problems typical of the Russian situation, and we do believe that, considering the reforms and transformations which were mentioned by Mr. Bystritsky, we will not only preserve all the positive traits which we accumulated for the last decade, but also will be able of making certain contributions, positive contributions. I hope very much that many of you present here participate in different discussions, numerous discussions, and many of those meetings focus mainly on stating certain facts which take place in our life, and there are many such facts. Sometimes those statements might result in certain mutual accusations or claims, but we lack a link. We should actually look one or two steps ahead, trying to somehow analyze what are the potential developments of the situation and what could be the repercussions, and what should we do that actually this development goes along the most pragmatic lines. If this our new shape of Valdai Club manages to contribute to the development of dialogue, it would be useful not only for the participants in our discussion, but also to the policymakers and decision makers. The question which we want to discuss today is the world order, new rules or no rules. And I think that this question is addressed to no one, not to strong nations or to weak nations, because the games without rules is in no one's interest. But the question which arises is how we interpret different rules, because no one abolished the Charter of the United Nations or Helsinki Accords. No one actually abolished or abrogated any of the documents signed at the summit meetings and which form the basics of the international law. Unfortunately, due to different reasons, and it has been mentioned more than once, after the end of the Cold War, the period of so-called slight negligent attitude towards the basic international principles started. And I do think that we have approached the limit when such an approach, such a frivolous interpretation of the law may threaten not only one or two communities, but the international community in general. And probably I will be subjected to criticism by many participants in our discussion. But I'm not actually a proponent of the conspiracy theory, but I participated in many events of the last decade, and I don't think that Bush's administration, when in the year 2003 started the military actions bypassing the UN resolution in Iraq, I don't think that this administration thought about eventually making room for potential encroachment of the Islamic militants and its aggression. I think that we can speak about certain failures, about certain miscalculations, when tactical resolutions and decisions prevail over the strategic analysis, and probably this is where we can see the lack of thought-out analysis of certain problems. I will not touch upon the document which we have received for consideration. This presentation, this report, is quite interesting, and still I would like to comment on one message: the role and place of the nuclear arms in the security system of different nations. This statement, out of one paragraph in this document, we can make a conclusion that today the security of the nations should depend on the development of the nuclear arms. And those who failed to read this document, I advise very much to read Mr. Akromeyev's Soviet Marshal's memories and Mr. Kornienko's memories. Some of you were lucky to work together with him. And I do think that their reputation, their image is certainly undoubted. Marshal Akhromenko in his memories writes why they presented to Mr. Gorbachev the plan to eliminate all the nuclear arms and weapons by the end of the 20th century. They justified this decision after they made serious analysis of the political situation, and the general staff and headquarters of the Soviet Union did this analysis, and they made a conclusion that the nuclear arms cannot be resorted to. And if any nation resorts to nuclear arms, it would be the end of our civilization. And therefore, probably the life evolves, the situation may change, but we should be rather cautious when we propose certain statements and when we propose certain resolutions and decisions, because it may result in different things. For instance, the Islamic Caliphate, which was born due to some political mistake, strategic mistake made in the year 2003, may eventually get hold of the nuclear arms. And this series of strategic failures, of strategic mistakes, may result in the fact that all the nations would be threatened and the security of all the nations would be threatened. And therefore, I think that Valdai Discussion Club should focus on such discussions with a view of the future. And this is what we would all appreciate. And finally, I would like to say a few words about the following. Certainly, we can accuse each of us of different sins, of different mistakes, and sometimes we are right, sometimes we are wrong. But proceeding from my own experience, I think that due to certain reasons, objective and subjective, after the end of the Cold War, no one dealt in serious with building of a new world order. The United States, believing that they are a victor, that they won the Cold War, they started building a monopolar world, and this started under Clinton administration. Europe, at that time, in its aspirations to expand, first of all, unified Germany, then allowed the accession of 10 new members, and then was enmeshed in its all problems. Russia actually had to deal with the questions related to its survival at that time. But if you read the political documents adopted after the end of the Cold War, you will never see any serious proposition about what the new world order should be, and what principles should back this new world order. I remember there was a very serious conversation at the General Assembly of the United Nations 10 years ago, and it was called the Millennium Assembly. On the threshold of the 20th and the 21st century, a very serious dialogue started at that time. And I think that Kofi Annan even built a second work group, the Wise Men work group, and Mr. Primakov was a member of this group, and they were to discuss the principles to back the new world order. But unfortunately, after that, all those intellectual exercises remained a lip service. And we may blame NATO, we may blame the Security Council, we may blame the United Nations or the Russian NATO Council, whatever, for all the failures. This is like a TV set, but we do not watch a TV set. We are watching television. We are watching different programs on TV. We, as the international community, we did not provide the content, the real programs which would comply with the new situation. And the sooner we deal with that, the sooner we'll contribute to these principles. Thank you so much, Mr. Ivanov. I would like to remind you that at the end of those presentations, certainly if we have some time, we'll start the general discussion on the issues which would be raised during the presentations. Now, Thierry Mareni, you're welcome.
Today's world is certainly global, but more and more unstable. As we celebrate the outbreak of the First World War, we must not forget the so-called First Globalization. It's ended tragically with the clash of nationalism in 1914. In 1911, a French socialist, Jean Jaurès, thought that this First Globalization, in particular that concerning the banks, was, I quote, the beginning of a capitalism solidarity, likely to become someday a guarantee for the peace. We all know what followed. As Professor Suzanne Berger pointed out, the immediate collapse of the international economic system in 1914 proves that the creation of an international order based on the rule of law and the peaceful resolution of conflicts can be achieved only through a deliberate political action. It's not enough to catch political skate order in a web or of economic interdependence. Let's think over this point at a time where the world order established after the Second World War is faltering. Today, United Nations is not better to solve problems than the League of Nations was for those linked to the invasion of Ethiopia on Manchuria. Many problems seem to be more and more intractable, from the Israel-Palestine conflicts to Syria, or of course, more recently, Ukraine. In Asia, the relationship between China and its neighbors are more and more complex. Search for raw materials, not to mention water in some part of the world, is a potential source of conflicts for the future, and I won't even speak of the threat caused by the increased number of nuclear weapon states. Peace is a fragile good. Recently, we could hear talks about the introduction of operational element in the nuclear policy. The use of a brute force is tempting for major world powers. To some extent, multilateralism, whose rise seemed inexorable, is today seriously threatened. The European Union, which seems to be the success story of a peaceful construction based on the rule of law and democracy, is full of self-doubt and generates doubt, even if it is fair to remember that Western European has been granted an unprecedented period of peace since 1945. Even if the European Union is a major economic power, it is very weak on an international stage. It lacks a consensus between its members of the objective of its foreign policy and adequate military means. A good example in this moment with Iraq. Women have legitimate doubts of legitimacy of the present world order. The United States themselves, in many regards, the architect of this order, have often shown some contempt for multilateralism and privileged an imperial attitude. Let's think of Afghanistan and Iraq. It's not a new phenomenon, but it is worsened by the increasing polarization of the political system of this country. Since 1945, we have basically known three great phases of the Cold World War, as had seen an East-West clash that neither the United States nor the URSS won until the 60s. It was the so-called balance of terror. Then, progressively, we reached a state that a Frenchman, Hubert Védrine, called the reign of the American hyperpower. Today, we come back to a more multipolar world, but very unstable. I understand those who want to change the present world order, based on the old realities, challenged by the increased role of emerging power, especially China. It's legitimate that such a powerful state like China seeks a world role which fits to its demographic and economic weight. Our world is not easy to govern, even though it is more and more independent. Think of sustainable development of internet, as we know. Many unacceptable situations still remain, from Syria to Iraq and Ebola. Should we come back to the old order, based on the clash between nations, the war being the continuation of diplomacy by other means? Europe was governed by such a system from 1648, the Peace of Westphalia, to 1914. I do not believe it, and this conference seems to me the perfect place to have a debate about this question. At this time, the concerned states were homogeneous. War has not the same consequences as today. In particular, atomic weapons did not exist. If we have to move toward a fairer and more collective order, we can wonder if such an order would be compatible with full respect of everyone's sovereignty. The answer is likely to be no, as it's true that a multilateral system, so highly desirable is today's world, implies some mutual losses of sovereignty. It could be one of today's issues. The question could be phrased like this: to what extent are these losses of sovereignty necessary? For what purpose and to what extent? Another question could be debated if there are room for morality in international relations. This issue is very pregnant in public opinion, as you know, in Europe. Which statute has law and international relation regulation? Europe stands for a vision of the world where law determines intergovernmental relation. Such a vision is obviously much better than that a world where the use of force is final arbiter. However, it has its limitation, external first. All states are not democracy or state government by the rule of law. Outside the European Union, the use of force or its threat still play a big part. It has also an international limitation. Another challenge to stability faced by all states is our continent, with the European Union respond only very imperfectly, that of immigration, which is a product of war, poverty. The Schengen system requires a major overhaul as well as the so-called Dublin EU regulation. We are only governing a certain helpfulness. As chairman of the Migration Committee of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, I can see each day the importance of the systems. Finally, still regarding Europe, how and what basis could be reached an agreement between all its components? For example, I personally believe that the European Union needs Russia, and Russia, of course, needs the European Union. Our goal must be to create a new international order which would be accepted by all without suffering disaster of a huge magnitude. Remember that the Peace of Westphalia was signed after the 30 Years' War. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Mariani. Thank you very much indeed.
For us to come closer to and faster to move closer to our discussion as soon as possible, I'd like to invite Yaroslav Ivanov to ask just to say a couple of words of inspiration to us. I do not know whether my words will be inspiring to you, but traditionally the focus of global researchers and political studies experts are on those that on the crises that we encountered at the end of the 20th century and possibility of imposition of its own will through force. But a global delineation of powers and labor is formed by some other factors as well, and I will list some of them, those that are of importance to my mind. That is, first, information and media as a system of presenting information. I believe that the last conflicts of this year, we have all seen the strength of the mass media and cultural impact that is tightly related to information. Within 15-20 years, we'll see the strength of another factor, that is longevity, medicine, and a better environment for living. But today we'll speak on about three factors: technology, education, and demography. These are factors that are interrelated. Labor markets are formed by demography and education, and this is all inevitably linked with education. Globalization is a process of multinational and pan-national developments with certain dependencies. When we speak about globalization, we quite often not only just speaking but also thinking, we forget about asymmetry that is present in all globalization. There's always a leader and there's always parties that win and lose. So world does not develop homogeneously, and it doesn't mean automatically that homogeneous communities are formed, as well as educational, technological, and labor market communities are formed homogeneously. So we should be well aware that single moral mode or exchange of academic results or rule of law does not mean automatically that there will be a unified system where where every participant will benefit equally. There are those who benefit more, there are those who benefit less. When a new strong factor gets into the fore, it moves towards homogeneity of the world, but the national players take notice of them and begin to use them for their national interests. So coalitions take place. We see that there is a global trend of fragmentation, and that's something that we have mentioned already, strengthening of economic and social dynamics. And quite often, this clusteralization happens with the national borders, and this leads to collapse of the global structure and global international institutions quite often. What new markets do in this environment of new factors? It's obvious that fragmentation of academic and technological development, as well as markets of human capital, have certain threats because of limitations imposed on sales markets and raw material markets, because the players introduce certain rules for that. That's what we see now. We are not quite evidently, not well articulated, but nevertheless there is an attempt to exclude Russia from acquiring results, from acquiring benefits of technological delineation. This is not well articulated yet, but still this mode is taking place. Technological and educational segmentation has its limitations. Naturally, they are determined by the limits of by the level of the participants. We're so used to that to say that in Africa and Asia there is a so-called second class of levels because of high poverty. But recently there is a trend towards segmentation of some other sort, which is related to artificial self-limitation and mutual limitation. This may lead to the following: several isolated markets. Simulation gives us the following: a Western market and a market that is formed on the basis of coalitions that will be organized by the countries that feel themselves infringed and hurt by the current situation. West will be going ahead by its speed of development, but according to our expert assessments, the result of a study as a result of artificial segmentation, we'll see that it will go by 1/3 among the leading countries and by 60% in those that lag behind. This reduction is even more dramatic than that we had during the Cold War, because the studies become more and more expensive. Studies during the past 50 years are by an order of magnitude more expensive than that used to be in the middle of the 20th century. The scale of spread will diminish even more, especially in the group that is lagging behind. So that means that the humanity will lose a lot because of this. The second group of countries will lose even more, and they will be in the rear by 2025. So we should assess the scenario of a high level of segmentation in education, and what's the price of that we're eager to pay. So to give up on mutual restrictions in this educational sphere. Demography. The demographic factor is well discussed in the world, and how it impacts the powers in the world. I will repeat here. Countries with low income per capita went up by the factor of 3, and the population of developed countries went up only by a factor of 1.5. That means that the share of developed countries went down by to 18% by 2010, and now it's close to 16%. By 2050, only 7% of the population of the world will live in the rich countries, not more than 7%. The United States will rank third. About 4% of the population of the world will live there, and as for Europe, it will shrink dramatically. By 2030, Latin America will run ahead of the United States and Canada together. Then there will be some reshuffling of some world giants such as India and China. There will be more in India living than in China. But we all forget about growth of Africa. Africa will be the demographic leader, no doubt, and it will run ahead of China in the nearest future. And by 2050, it will exceed by its population the developed world by 1.8. By the factor 1.8, and it will be 4 times more than bigger than Europe, and this will exacerbate the conflict between South and North. I will not drive any conclusions here. I believe that everybody of those present here is capable of doing that on their own. Another problem is the aging of the population. Not more than 80% of Europe are young people, and 50% are those that are senior citizens. So this aging. The fast-developing countries of Asia and Latin America will be on the same track. In China, every fifth inhabitant of the world lives in China over the age of 60. So 65 plus is the age that will be typical of China after 2015. So aging of the population is a major difficulty for the world. And it is regarded in many cases as national. So with national pension systems, they are unstable practically in all countries. And the collapse of national pension systems with high probability will happen not only in Russia, but it is forecasted in many more countries of the world. What do I mean by the collapse of the national pension system? That means destruction of the mechanisms of the stock exchange market, because pension funds make the core of the stock market. So we should think well what about the consequences of to economy, and social and political consequences will come along with that. That's something that should be on our agenda, I believe. Another important phenomenon is international migration. Currently, we see that the ethnic, racial, and picture is changing, because migrations, flow of migration consists of more than 100,000 million. And demographic pressure and gap in the lifestyles and the levels of income are dramatic. So migrants actually are those that sustain the economic growth. I mean, not demographic growth, but economic growth of countries. We use cheap labor of migrants to boost efficiency of national production system, and Russia, in this regard, is very similar to those of developed Western countries, very much similar to them, and it is challenged by the same factors. So we have 2 trends here: limitation of attempts to limit migration flows in low quality and higher competition, and probably introduction of the system of national qualification quotas for highly skilled workers. Education is one thing that can help us here, but with a low level of education, we see that there will be outflow of those who have not enough education. That will lead us to attempts to limit the export of educated people. And this will naturally affect negatively on the current system of educational systems and rights, human rights. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to pass the microphone to Masahiro Akiyama, President of the Tokyo Foundation.
Thank you, Chair Andre. I'm very honored to be here this morning, and thank you very much for inviting to this. I am a new face to the Valdai Conversation Club, and I'm not a specialist or expert on global order, or I'm not a specialist on Russia. So I appreciate it if you listen to me, one voice from one of ordinary people, Japanese. Many difficulties and crises are facing us worldwide. From the viewpoint of difficulties of global governance. I'd like to pick up just 3 issues out of them to save time. The Ukraine crisis and the rise of Islamic State and the territorial disputes in South China Sea. The Ukraine crisis is, I would say, somewhat a special case. It seems to it appears to breach the territorial sovereignty by forces of foreign country. But we have to take into account the historical factors for formulating the state of Ukraine. That is strong ethnic and religious split in the country, and also the special relations to Russia. I suspect that Ukraine agenda has been mishandled by Western countries for the past several years, while the country was, how can I say, poorly administrated by an ineffective authority. The United States has unnecessarily turned Russia into political enemy, moreover, so that Russia and China have become very close, rising possible a new Cold War. At the same time, Russia could have opted not to intervene militarily. I think Russia has lost a lot of credibility in international community. At the moment, at least, I think the crisis in East Ukraine should be solved as soon as possible, based upon the common sense of the rules of law or international law, and I would say the nation-state concept. I think it can be done through top summit between two countries. As I think the President Poroshenko and the President Putin are most familiar with the special status of Ukraine and the special geopolitical situation here. South China Sea, it's another difficult problem from the viewpoint of international law or the nation-state concept. The relationship between the international law and the effective controls over the islands, reefs, and rocks in the sea are not clear. And also, the recent China's assertiveness is another big concern in the international community. But I think it is not impossible to find a solution through the negotiation in a peaceful manner. I think, or exactly speaking, I expect that China will do so based on its how can I say, hope to become the responsible great power here. The U.S. rebalancing policy back into the Asia and the international community having been very interested in the disputes will help this movement. The biggest problem is the rise of ISIS. It has gotten advanced in independent financial resources and weapon stockpiles acquired while the United States had lowered its profile in the region. But fortunately, the United States and the Western countries have made a decision to commit to fight against the ISIS by using forces. It's a little too late, but better late than never. If the international law or the system based on the rules of law, international law, and the nation-state system is breached by the forces or by military sergeants, there is no choice to use the military forces to fight against these groups. As you may know, ISIS is violent and fundamental terrorist groups, and it doesn't respect the international systems and the the nation-state concept at all. With regard to the title of this session, the global governance, or the limits of governability or systematic failure, I think introducing a new world order is just easier said than done. And also the very task of formulating a viable concept of a new world order is very difficult, I think. The important thing is to discuss or find a solution on how to manage the world based on the common concept, based on the rules of laws or international law, and I would say the nation-state system introduced in the Treaty of Westphalia. And sometimes the using military forces to fight against the military sergeants if it's breached the system is inevitable. And in that case, I think the international community's unification is the most important. I don't think it's conducted only by a superpower. Maybe many blocs and countries should be engaged in the fight against these groups. And also, I think the discussion on the new function or review the function of the United Nations Security Committee is very important, because the United States and Russia and China are core members of the Council. They have to start the discussion how to make the function of the how to make the Council functionable. And also, finally, I'd like to refer to the point that the rift in the, I would say, the West and the East relationship would undermine the global governability. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. В общем, наша дискуссия приобретает, я думаю...
Our discussion is turning into a universal discussion of global, galactical scale, and there was a lot of discussion today. Let me be honest with you that the presentations of my colleagues, especially the factors that Professor Kuzminov mentioned, testify to the fact that right in front of our eyes we have a significant change in how we see the development of the modern world. If we talk about developing new rules of the game, we need to understand that the existing concepts and visions of today's world are not very suitable, are not very functional for today's analysis. A very rich case here is the situation in the Middle East and how we view that. It's enough to look at the evolution of reality and its perception, from revolutionary romantic to Islamic quasi-democracy and back to secular authoritarianism. And our Western colleagues happen to be all right with that. But there was also the reincarnation of the Islamic extremist state which was seemingly conquered by the coalition in Afghanistan in the early 2000s. So the attempts to find explanations to this process through the prism of the legacy of the Cold War, the great chessboard, and the end of histories and clash of civilizations is operationally non-productive. You can respond to modern challenges in the tactical way, and Mr. Ivanov called us to think in the strategic form, but you can also respond tactically, and you have to when challenges turn into threats which are extinguished by the military power of several superpowers of their coalition, but leaders and professional foreign policy community have formed this perhaps illusionary idea of the nature of world order, which can be regulated. To stick to those habits and practices, we need the understanding of the global world of the same level that the predecessors of today's politicians had. Let me remind you that in 1940s, 1950s, they were able to create a system of global multilateral institutions, or at least in the western part of that world, which still are working efficiently or not today. With all the criticism of the UN, there's nothing to replace these inventions of 70 years ago. When we try to create multilateral institutions in the last couple of decades, we can be more skeptical about it. Think about the informal leader club when they all of a sudden change their agenda, reject one of their participants whose approaches to a specific international problem were different from those of his colleagues in the club. But this idea of clubs, para-organizations, or sustainable ad hoc coalitions seems to be efficient. If we look at the conflicts of post-bipolar worlds, their successful completion was linked with the systemic participation of the interested parties, be it the Madrid process, the anti-terrorist coalition, or the Dayton process, Yugoslavia, mosaic pieces, or chemical weapons in Syria. As we deal with the Ukrainian crisis, or at least its external aspects, it lies among the efficient multilateral efforts. And if we do not analyze the tragic nature of Ukrainian situation, still it showed that the European system of security and economic interdependency was based on double standards and sometimes without enough responsibility. The Cold War logic, if you are not with us, then you are against us, followed in the Ukrainian affairs since the Orange Revolution, and some elements of that logic could be found in the actions of the Russian side, but it was started by the European colleagues when they referred to the rigid bureaucratic rules of European integration and expansion of the EU. Such country as Ukraine deserves to have its own approach developed specifically for that country, stating the vagueness of parameters of the modern system from the point of view of traditional ideas of the global order. We can still focus on one dominating idea. We see dramatic interdependency of countries, international processes, economics, and politics. The density of modern world turned it into such a multi-aspect model that can be ever more difficult to calculate, and we have more and more threatening factors that were discussed today. That's why many in Russia look at sanctions with philosophical calm, and competitive advantages all of a sudden turn into encumbrances. And another issue is the methods of competition, competitive advantages, the leaders of this competition, and as a consequence, the leaders of today's world. Countries that are called or considered to be great powers fix their leadership status but cannot always confirm it. A leader is not just someone who is ahead, but also it's the one that is followed by others. So it's a unique element of responsibility in the world economics and politics. Saint-Exupéry once wrote, "We are responsible for those whom we befriended." And do we have leaders who can be described like that. The story is more complicated. The rules of the games, the rules of behavior in the international arena are much more complicated. The number of quality of modern conflicts and crises, they are much more active than during the period of the Cold War. And we see the absence of such rules. One colleague just mentioned the situation of the international law. And of course, we do have some everlasting principles set by Gugo Grotze that we all studied when we were university students. But it's also clear that many elements of the international law set by or during the period between wars and after the war is not completely up to date with the modern realities. And of course, this work is not easy, it's complicated, but nevertheless we need to codify a common international law, because now some new terms have been coined. You can see that they are not recognized by public law, such as humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect, and others. But I still believe it would be correct to think about, at a very high international level, codifying the modern international law. And you know, as I close, I recently had a meeting with an old acquaintance of mine, a major European businessman. When we began to discuss the situation, and a lot is being said about Ukrainian events, of course, he kept saying to me that, you know, the entire international system, from his point of view, could be compared with a joint stock company. In a joint stock company, if you a minority shareholder has certain percentage and majority holder, talking about GDP, may have 20 times more shares, the minority shareholder should accept the position of the majority. I think it's an incorrect approach as we talk about international community. Even in a joint stock company, a minority shareholder can play a very important role and disrupt the entire situation for the joint stock company. And when we talk about countries and leaders, we have to pay attention to all circumstances that define a certain country as a leader or as a big player in the international arena. If we use such approach, and some of our friends promote this approach, if we used that joint stock company principle to the international community, it would not only lead to chaos, but to unpredictable and horrible consequences. Thank you. Thank you. In the middle of our session, even the helicopters began flying above us. They are smelling the great intellectual ideas. And now we are moving on to the final part of our comments. I will give the floor to Ivan Krastev and Fyodor Lukyanov. Why they are at the end of this session? Because both of them are responsible and authors of the editors of the report that you have all been given, and it was mentioned today and will be mentioned many times here today and in the next couple of days. I would like to ask Ivan Krastev to say a few words. Thank you.
Minority shareholder, so which means that Fyodor did most of the work. But these days it's very fashionable to go back to the 1914 and to try to see the logic of the disintegration of political orders. There is a beautiful novel by Joseph Roth called Radetzky Marsh. And this is basically telling the story of the disintegration of the Habsburg Empire. And in this novel there is a moment which is revealing. There is a group of very loyal Habsburg officers which heard the news of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. They're overexcited, there is a crisis, They're so excited that every one of them starts speaking their native language. The Hungarians started to speak first in Hungarian. In 5 minutes, which used to be this type of Austro-Hungarian space, basically collapsed. And there was one of the characters who was a kind of the embodiment of this Habsburg loyalty, which all the time was just pleading, please speak German. So this is what I'll try to do. I'm pleading you speak German, not in the concrete sense, I don't speak German myself. The only problem is that part of the crisis that we face now is a disintegration of the common analytical language. I do believe one of the problems which we're seeing these days is that many of the world powers are starting to become the victims of their own propaganda and the way they're trying to frame different conflicts. So this is why I'll try to make just two very simple points. One is I'm going to argue that it is much more instability within the states, and I'm talking about great states. I'm not talking about failed states. That explains the tensions in the international order than the competition between states. It's not so much the shift of power from the west to the east, but this is what Moises Naim, in my view, nicely called the end of power. The fact that these days it's much easier to get power, much easier to lose power, but it's very difficult to exercise power. And this is difficult on the level of government, this is difficult on the level of company, this is difficult on all levels. And as a result of it, this deficit of power is changing the nature of the international competition. If before the international competition was you're mobilizing your local resources in order to have impact abroad, these days we can see that many states attempted to mobilize global resources in order to bring stability at home. And this type of a different logic also is explained by the fact that nevertheless that we like to talk about asymmetry of power, one of the interesting stories is that this day we're living in the age of the weak. Being weaker does not mean that you're going to lose. There was this famous study being done by colleagues in Harvard, which shows that if in the period 1880-15, when there was this asymmetrical wars between stronger power in terms of wealth and military capacity and the weaker power, in this period between 18 and 1850, only 12% of the time the weaker power managed to achieve its objectives. In the period 1950-1988, in the 55% of the cases, the weaker power managed to basically achieve its objectives. And we can see this in Afghanistan, we can see in other places, because these days, to win means for the weaker power simply to be able to disrupt. And this type of a route of disruption, where basically regulating disruptions is becoming the major way the international order functions, in my view is critically important. And here comes my second point. I just finished and published this summer a book on the global protest movements in the world. And because I know that, especially in the Russian debate, the problem of sovereignty and the popular protests is very much debated, let's give you my reading of this. In the period since the beginning of the global financial crisis, there were major mass political protests in 70 countries in the world. Some of these countries were democracies, others were non-democracies. Some of these countries were rich, others were poor. Some of them have been very much affected by the economic crisis, like Portugal or Spain, but others like Brazil basically were doing quite well during the crisis. I'm saying this because obviously, if you try to look at this, it much more looks as a kind of a special political epidemics. This is kind of a totally new understanding of the politics, and what makes these protests otherwise being very different and very contextual is four things that are quite important. Most of them are not led either by major opposition parties or trade unions. They come from nowhere. They are leaderless. They're very much based on new technologies, social media and others. They don't have a clear ideological profile. If before the revolutions used to have ideological name, now they have a company name, Facebook, Twitter. So I'm saying all this because it's quite important to understand the dynamics of these protests, because I do believe they're going to stay with us. They're not going to disappear. And to think about them in terms of classical revolutions also is going to be very much misleading. I'm saying this because any government, and unfortunately here there is not much difference between democratic and non-democratic governments when it comes to protest in their own countries, try to view this protest very much as being instigating from abroad. You can blame America, you can blame Russia, you can blame anybody else, but the idea is that it comes from outside. Unfortunately, or fortunately, they came from inside. They can be used by outside powers, like any type of a political destabilization could be. But they're very much part of the changing pattern of politics these days, because we're living in a society where the mistrust is the default option. People don't trust political leaders, people don't trust institutions, and this type of a new moment of distrust is very much embodied in these political movements. Don't forget, many of them go on the street even without clear demands. Their only basically demand is, we are the people. And from this point of view, and this is my last point, I do believe that regulating this type of international order means that it's not enough to reform the institutions. And this is not even enough, basically, to have a kind of a consensus on the elite level. The basic problem is that the elites are very much under attack in all parts of the world. Political elites, but also business elite, cultural elites. And from this point of view, trying to make sense of these movements is going to be of great importance. Probably part of the West made the mistake to try to believe that this type of a movement is just a sign of a democratization and westernization of the world. This is not true. On the other side, I do believe that Russia is very much in the tendency to make the opposite mistake, to have Nikola's first reaction, basically believing that you can stop and arrest this type of movements. Listen, there is no international order that can guarantee you that there are not going to be people on the streets, on any street, in any capital. And from this point of view, because I started with 1914, during the 1815 Vienna Congress, there was this famous remark between Maastricht and the Russian Tsar Alexander. Maastricht told him, stability is something different than immobility. So I do believe we should try to look for a type of a stability that is taking this type of political dynamics into account. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Спасибо большое.
Thank you so much. And Fyodor Lukyanov, you take the floor. Thank you. Well, actually, the material, the document which has been distributed, which has been disseminated, this is not the official report of the Valdai Club, which we hope very much would be finished at the end of our discussion based on the contributions and interventions in many of you, and the final report will bring together all the opinions. And we will finally mention all those who contributed to that, and we met in Moscow. There was a final meeting in Vienna. Part of you were present there. The main objective was quite complicated and sophisticated, because what we were talking about just shows that the processes which surround us are very multifaceted. Therefore, we may not bring them together, or a degree of abstraction is required in order to put everything in order, but it will not result in any specific recommendations how we should deal with that. The title of our session, of our opening session, what is going on, the limits of governability or systemic failure, is quite relevant. I think that we all, and first of all, people who are involved in the government, I mean the political leaders, would like to think about that, about the limits of governability, meaning that they would avoid any responsibility for the current political processes. So if we have reached the limits of governability, then we should not require anything of them or demand anything of them. But what Mr. Kuzminov said was clearly very important. He outlined the untraditional, unconventional factors which affect politics and geopolitics. And we may feel a little bit pessimistic and frustrated, meaning that we may think that we cannot do anything about that. But our position at least what we wanted to incorporate in this report, in this document, which has been disseminated, is about a systemic failure. After the end of the previous international period, the so-called period of the Cold War, which, despite all its negative factors, was quite orderly, and it was very well structured in contrast to other periods in our political history. But now we see that many processes lead us to many illusions. The illusion that the world order may set up on its own, that all of a sudden everything would be resolved, for instance, that the Cold War is over by itself. One of the stakeholders, one of the parties to this conflict has been destroyed, I mean the USSR, and a new order would emerge 25 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union on its own. Now we realize that nothing would emerge, and there were no precedents of that in the history. If we remember all the world orders, successful or failed ones, they actually would be worded and would be set up by the victors, by the winners, and actually, the situation is as follows, that everyone understands who won the war or who won in this battle, but no one would recognize that officially. And certain factors would be silenced. There would be more misunderstanding about what is going on in the world among the stakeholders of the political processes, and therefore we see the big picture which has cropped out. One of the illusions, or one of the fundamental illusions of that time, was about the new economic system, or global economic system, would set everything in order, that the global economy would impose the principles, the political principles would be expedient and which would make sense. Actually, the real experience, the real life showed that this is not the case. The national conflicts, the national political contradictions remained, and those conflicts stayed, and the total interdependence which we see under the globalized economy is not. This is actually something aggravating the situation, exacerbating the situation. This is not a bliss, but rather a curse, when every step would affect other stakeholders, and it may be even worse than it used to be before. Before, we spoke about isolated systems or economic systems and about the competition among them. Right now, we see the mutual influence or mutual affecting. And those who lack raw materials, but if they have certain media resources or some military potential, they try to compensate with what they have for what they lack. And therefore, certain distortions might be observed, new conflicts may emerge, and it would be difficult to deal with those conflicts because they're absolutely asymmetrical. And for instance, Mr. Ivanov pointed out one of the paragraphs of our document which specifies the use of nuclear weapons. I would like to clarify that. We do not say that nuclear arms are good or bad, but in the context when there is no common understanding how the system works, when no rules are interpreted or set up, everyone tries to be supported by something they have, and nuclear weapons, nuclear arms, is one of the most powerful military and political tools. And those who possess of nuclear arms, they try to strengthen their arsenal, their stockpile, in order to show that they are still strong. And those who are weak, they try to get hold of the nuclear weapons. because they see it as something handy, see it as one of the tools. And Marshall Akrami, when he wrote about what you have quoted, the situation was quite different. The processes could be governed then, could be regulated then, and it is hardly the case today. In this rather difficult situation, there are two ways out, and I may not even be in the position to say which is better. One of them is more pragmatic. This is about cooperation, about defining some common rules of the game and agreeing on the norms of the behavior, but we are failing in that respect due to the asymmetric nature, due to very deep misunderstanding, which we see even worse than in the Cold War, when the political leaders, they live in different worlds, in different, actually, galaxies even. And during the breakfast, we exchanged opinions with my colleagues, actually saying that people are short of sense of humor, no longer have the sense of humor, and you may not even say something funny or crack a joke. Once you crack a joke, it would be immediately discussed in the media, and it may result in certain repercussions and consequences. And as a result, one would like to be protected against those external influences, to remain isolated. Whether it is possible or not, this is a different question, but the message is clear. It will entail further fragmentation of the society. And Professor Akiyama mentioned something related to China, the notion of a responsible world stakeholder or player, that we would require such a consensus and such players or stakeholders. But let us discuss what responsibility would mean. A responsible stakeholder, this is an American notion, and the Americans try to replicate this notion in other countries, but bearing in mind that America or the United States is a responsible stakeholder and others are not. But if we take the American foreign policy for the last decade as a paragon of responsibility, that it would result in a world crisis, I think that this definition of responsibility would require further specification and clarification. And again, what Mr. Akiyama mentioned, he brought us back to Westphalian principles, which used to work for about 200 years, and actually we are thinking a little bit Europe-centrically and Asian-centrically. I think that the Asian nations emerged much earlier than the Westphalian principles were adopted. Back in Europe, we remember this period and we start to trace our history back to the Westphalian principles, but the rest of the world lives on its own. And now a new age emerges when all those cliches, all those interpretations should be regarded as something equal. There should be some common opinion about, some consensus about all those perceptions of the world, so that we do not destroy each other. And therefore, we would remedy the systemic failure which is in the topic of our discussion. Thank you so much. We may proceed with the next phase of our session, the Q&A session. Let us discuss what has been said, but I would ask you first of all, certainly you can crack a joke, and as Mr. Lukyanov said, and please introduce yourself, because although we know each other well, but there are some new faces there, so please introduce yourself. You'll be number 2, you is number 1.
Center for Strategic and International Studies, Washington, D.C. Thanks to all the panelists for presenting a really rich intellectual goulash for us to chew on this morning. Really, it was terrific, and I think is a very good scene setter for the rest of our discussions. I'll just want to make 3 quick observations and maybe leave you with a question. From a more sort of say from a realist international relations theory standpoint, what makes this period now feel less stable is the fact that we're in a period of transition. If there was the bipolar order during the Cold War, maybe a brief sense of a unipolar order for some time after the Cold War, I mean, now we are really in a transition to a multipolar world where the positions of rising, falling powers is more questionable and dubious, and we know historically that these are always times of greater instability, danger, and unpredictability. Of course, Ivan Kraschev introduced a very interesting idea about the fundamental weakness of nation states themselves, actually, to address and resolve problems, which I think is quite significant. For the Cold War, I think there is a certain tendency to romanticism of the stability of the Cold War today. I think those that were practitioners and policymakers during the Cold War certainly didn't feel that way. I was just reading Steve Sestanovich's new book, Maximalist, on U.S. foreign and security policy from 1945 on. It's an excellent read, but that was one of the points that came through strongly to me, that, and I think that the difference is that while there was an ordering principle of the two superpowers and their various clubs of allies lined up behind them, the danger was heightened because smaller differences had the possibility to rise to escalation of possible nuclear conflict. Whereas today, what maybe creates a sense for us of greater instability is the fact that, and this kind of may touch upon what Ivan was saying, it's the frustration we have that we can't easily solve these problems. The Ukraine crisis is, to me, not a global problem. It is a reflection of the fact that we've not resolved the issue of a European security system since the end of the Cold War, and that's what it reflects. The territorial conflicts in East Asia are also, I think, symptomatic of, this transitional period where some states, which might have been defenders of the Westphalian status quo and the norm of national sovereignty, are changing their position somewhat. But it feels more unstable because we can't resolve them. ISIS is not really a global problem. I know that, sure, it would be mind-blowing if there were public beheadings on Times Square or in Red Square or in Tiananmen Square or many squares around the world, but it's not really of a global urgency of the nature of, let's say, the danger of a nuclear war that we faced during the Cold War. But we see them all the time, and we're frustrated that we can't resolve them, and I think it makes us feel more nervous. I don't see even Ebola. Now, Ebola crisis is certainly, it carries the sense that a pandemic flu could present a global urgency. Ebola itself doesn't appear not so much, but again, the challenges of trying to resolve it are very, very difficult and complicated. So I guess the question I would leave you with is kind of it's more for pondering, I think, for the rest of the conference, because the formulation of the question is kind of problematic. The world order, new rules or no rules? Well, there are lots of old rules. And they're not necessarily so bad. There is difficult in reaching consensus about following them on occasions, but that's always going to be the case. And I'm wondering to what extent our panelists think that we have to throw out the old rules to create new rules, or are we talking more about how we revise and try to improve the implementation of existing old rules in older institutions? Thanks.
Спасибо. Я хотел бы сказать, что у нас осталось...
Thank you very much. We have quite a little time for this session, but I invite contributors more brief. So, your comment, please. Thank you very much. Dmitry Suslov, High School of Economics and Expert Council of the Valdai Club. I'd like to get back to the title of this panel, Limits of Governance or Systemic Collapse. So it was said that one of the panels said that it's a systemic collapse, but the dramatic situation is that we have both. We're still, I think that what we are facing are both limits of governability and systemic failure. And I think that systemic failure doesn't reflect well enough the depth of the current crisis, because failure means that a system used to work well after the Cold War, and then something went wrong for the systems. But we should say that the system didn't work well, and after the end of the Cold War, it was, and Igor Ivanov was right saying that different superpowers promoted different sets of rules and different sets of world order, or insisted on different roles that they should play in the world order. But the drama of the current situation is not only incompatibility of the current rules promoted by Russia and China on the one hand, and the United States and Europe on the other hand, but the problem is that both parties began to breach the rules that they set up after the Second World War. That means that we breach not only somebody else's rules, but our own rules, and the Ukrainian crisis illustrates that very well. This attitude towards sovereignty in stability of borders. So that's not only relevant with regards to Ukraine, but also policy towards the Islamic State and policy towards Syria or Egypt and Arabian Spring as a whole. So all parties preach the vision of the world order presented by other parties, but their own vision as well. It's not only incompatibility of various models of global vision. This takes against the background of diffusion of force that Ivan Krastev mentioned, when superpowers cannot rule, cannot govern anymore, when there is a crisis of governability, inability to govern at all. So if we at least try to approach this path of way out, we should speak about governability. Traditionally, it is understood as superpowers governing the world processes, the vertical governance, governability, but should we have horizontal governability? Well, this is something not clear, but it's quite obvious that old approaches to governing do not work. So I'll return to my starting point. The current situation, to my mind, reflects very well the complexity or this that we have both limits of governability and systemic failure, and this is the peculiarity of the current moment. Thank you very much. I see many of those who are willing to contribute. I invite you, well, so that we have time for everyone to make a comment or ask a question, I invite you to be brief, but very concise. Andrew says that we have actually 3 days for that. So I think Barack Obama, when he spoke about Cold World '02, he challenged the bloc thinking, and he appealed to bloc thinking, and leaders of global politics and global players in the world began to play the old game that we have played for 50 years. Currently, actually, we follow the rules of the global market, though. So it's more refers us to the problem of political psychology than real challenges. It's not about formulating new rules or absence of rules. They are given to those who begin to use them. It is beneficial to try to share, to split the mineral bases of Europe. In Ukraine, then, while they do that, it is beneficial to some people to support this coup d'état. Well, they support that. But it is Russia who is losing its reputation for some reason in all that. I believe that for us to return the world order in its status quo, we need to see that the return to the systemic, to the law, to the international law should be fulfilled on a mandatory basis, and then this disaster will, and this darkness will disappear, I believe.
Goma, French Institute for International Relations. First of all, thanks to all the panelists for their very brilliant presentation. I would like to follow up with what was said by Andy about the romanticism of the Cold War. I think that Cold War was stable in Europe, but unstable elsewhere, and I think it's important to keep this fact in mind. And the second observation is, it seems to me that sometimes we have a very dark reading of the post-Cold War period, the period from 1991 to 2008. And I think there are basically two facts to remind regarding this period. The first one is globalization was possible and helps to get away from poverty a lot of countries. And the second key fact is also the rise of China. I think it's interesting to remind that in 1991, the USSR and China were similar in economic terms, and now, 23 years after, it makes no sense to compare both countries. And that leads me to my question about the future relation that the panelists could expect or could describe of the relationship between China, Russia, and the US. Because it seems to me that there is an attempt from Russia to see that there are only now 3 global powers, and I think it's very overstretching for Russia. That's my personal vision. But could you please help me to understand the vision you could have of the relation between China, Russia, and the US in the next decade, for instance?
Спасибо. Нет. Андрей, чуть позже.
Give the floor to Andrei a little bit later. I would like to make my comments and turn to Ivanov, ask him, why don't we consider the situation when the ingovernability becomes obvious and irreversible, and the number of problems and challenges that are accumulating rapidly will not bring us to a catastrophe. And the catastrophe will be that the regulator that has always been on the course of our global historical practice. My feeling is that countries, in the face of their headquarters, feel this, and that's why they revisit and revise their military doctrines. Do you think that when people get disillusioned in global governance, they will get to mobilization projects, so to say, and to the formula of totalitarity, and then the whole world will become the world of totalitarian rule?
I want to come back to Ivan Krastiev's opening, when he refers to the disintegration of common analytical language. I think it's worse than that. I think what you describe is systematic of something much deeper, and that is a disintegration of a common analytical, a common grasp of reality. And I'm not sure how new or old this is, but it has become very clear, and even in these circles, it creates a sense of futility. The problem is this: even if miraculously we could all agree, as I wish we could, there will be no more regime changes. There will be no more policy of regime change. That is not going to stop somebody else thinking that country A has brought about a regime change in country B. This is where the Ukrainian crisis causes such a sense of futility. I am perfectly confident in my own ability to argue, not prove, but argue there was no coup in Ukraine. But that is not going to convince half the people in this room, because they are coming from a completely different set of premises and have a completely different prism through which they are looking at these things. And these examples, unfortunately, are increasingly multiplied across all areas of controversy on a global scale. And it is that which, to my mind, makes so much of the systemic and institutional discussion so impractical and so pointless. On that cheerful note, I'll end. Thank you.
Спасибо, thank you. First of all, do you like to say something? Yes?
Well, I'm Abraham Chaleni. I have a general question and a specific question. New rules or no rules? Is that the only choice that we have between new rules and no rules? Or is there a different choice between one set of rules for some and another set of rules for others? Because if you look at developments over the last 15 years, especially armed interventions and military campaigns, since the bombing of Serbia and the separation of Kosovo from Serbia, a lot of those developments can be explained by the second choice. Then I have a specific question for Akiyama-san. Akiyama-san expressed hope of a peaceful resolution of disputes in the South China Sea. The South China Sea, as we know, has become an important hotbed of tensions, and it's influencing American foreign policy towards Asia too. My question is, how does his hope square with the fact that one power involved in the disputes there has acceded to UNCLOS but refused to accept the dispute settlement mechanism under UNCLOS, the mechanism known as ITLOS. So if you have one power acceding to a treaty but refusing to accept dispute settlement, how does that really open the path to dispute settlement?
Спасибо, thank you very much. Mr. Skidelsky, please.
Thank you, Robert Skidelsky. I'd like to address a question to Ivan Krastev and also a comment. It seems to me in your interesting remarks, you fail to distinguish between popular protest in functioning and failed states, in legitimate and illegitimate states. Protest is much less violent, much more containable, in some states than others. In other words, the democratic deficit is unevenly spread across states. And that's why I think the parallel with the First World War isn't entirely accurate. The main drivers of war were states that were in important respects illegitimate. Do you think that there would have been a great catastrophe in 1914 had all the European states had constitutional democracies?
Thank you very much. Now, your question, please, your remarks. Пожалуйста, вот коллеги дайте.
Please give this microphone to this colleague.
I think today's topic is very important and also very on time. But still, I think when we discuss that kind of the issues, just like world order, how we can imagine the new world order, what kind of rule we should follows, still will face very big problem and differences. I think I'd like to mention two things. One thing, particularly when we talk something about the New World Order, we need the sincere cooperation among the major powers, particularly. Always I remember, for example, in the beginning of the new century, particularly 2001, why US, Russia, Europe, including China, that time we can got so good cooperation, although that time not so long. My understanding is that because we face the common threat that time. Now, I think to some degree the situation is similar. That is the first thing. The second thing is I think we should also pay attention how we can get the theoretical consensus. For example, for China, China still is very young later. China still is developing, I think, the countries. So we should respect history and international law. But to some degree, we also should pay attention what kind of very complicated structure of international law. What is the first priority for that kind of comprehensive law system? We should more understand and get more consensus. Finally, when we talk peaceful approach, always more important than using force. I'd like mention one situation just some days ago in Shanghai, because I come down from Shanghai. There was an open discussion. Personally, with some military generals in China. We remember one historical case that after the end of the Second World War, I mean, 15 later, the 40 years and the beginning 50 years, that time more than 1,000 Japanese war criminals had remained in China. After long-term education, of course, I believe that kind of education more efficient. That kind of the form of the Japanese general not only recognize the own crime, but also while they returned to Japan, they became more a very important key social element for anti-war. I think they provide a very strong guarantee for peaceful development and peaceful progress in Japan. So why I'd like to mention this issue, because always I believe peaceful approach more important than the use of force. Even, for example, during the time of 50 years, China is not strong. Even now, China is still not strong. But anyway, I think the education and the communication more important to any that kind of using force. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Migranyan.
I don't really like to make these additional comments. It's always more pleasant to be a soloist and to get considerable time for presentation, but there were a number of points made that I disagree with. That's why my brief comment. First of all, I think that it's quite obvious that starting from the year 2000, the crisis of governability is linked to a very important thing, the collapse of international balance. When the main actor of globalization decided that they could no longer limit themselves with any sorts of obligations, whether they are related to international law or international institutions. Condoleezza Rice was saying this in the year 2000 when we had a conversation in Moscow, in Carnegie. She was saying, understand, we are too strong to limit ourselves by anything. We will do what is in our interest. And today's crisis is the crisis of the most important actor in the globalization. The US is going through a global crisis, and this global crisis hits the rest of the system of international relations. What is this crisis about? It seemed back then that the US was able to govern the world alone, to do nation building, state building, and regime change. In the last decade, it turned out that in neither of these areas the result was positive. On the contrary, the result was very negative. And let me disagree here with Ivan. The point is not that nation states have internal weaknesses and this chaos and instability are the result of domestic factors. No, on the contrary, the global superpower decided that they can create new regimes, new states, new nations, and they engage in all these processes and destroy these nation states. Perhaps from Sofia, you think these small countries cannot cope with their own problems, but I think in many small countries the chaos and the deep problems and the disintegration are the result of the activities of big countries. First of all, the global state that is now involved in many regions. They are trying to arbitrarily construct new countries, new regimes, new states. What shall we do in this situation? I think that we may have had a poor balance, but at least there was some kind of balance between the US and the USSR, and it gave some order to this world. The people followed the norms of the international law, and they were not like Ottoman sultans that my law is at the end of my sword. So this process will take a long time. Why? Because the US today is quite strong yet to keep this going, but they are not strong enough for efficiently governing, managing, ruling this system on their own. The balance is going to be restored when the US will be relatively weaker, much weaker than today, and the emerging countries will, when they get stronger. And then the US perhaps will learn to not only have opponents with whom they have a war, and but will learn to be partners with other countries, which will be the prerequisite for forming of the new balance. And then we will come out of this crisis. Perhaps international law, general law, only work when countries are equal enough to force the opposing side to follow the court decision. And I think this is what's happening today. Thank you. We only have a little time. I want to give now panelists their chance to speak in these last remaining 10 minutes. So let's sum up and what you think about the comments and questions that you heard. If you don't mind, let's go from right to left.
I think I have two questions or comments to me. The first one is related to South China Sea. I think United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea does not provide us answers to the resolution, because the problem is that territorial disputes. Territorial disputes should be resolved based on the international laws or rules of law. The difficult aspect is that the effective controls over the islands, reefs, rocks are not clear for each coastal state. And this point is very important, how to, think the territorial sovereignty on these islands. And also, if it's a territory of land, the concept of, the nation-state system is another important factor. But the concept of nation-state, how can I say, does not apply to the effective control on these islands. So in that sense, it's a very difficult problem from the viewpoint of international law. But anyway, as I mentioned, I expect China to try to find the solution through the negotiation in a peaceful manner, based on its aspiration to become the responsible great power there. It depends on the, very frankly speaking, the internal political situation in China. And also I expect the young leaders or next generations to understand this situation. And the Chinese scholar referred to the militarism of Japan, referring to maybe the Prime Minister's visit to Yasukuni Shrine, right? I would like to tell you that, well, it's true that some prime ministers have visited Yasukuni Shrine to pay the respect to the soldiers and other people who lost life for our country during the wartime, since the Meiji Revolution. Many soldiers and people have been enshrined in the Yasukuni Shrine. The problem is that in late 1970s, maybe, the former, as he mentioned, the General Tojo was enshrined in the Yasukuni Shrine. But it's important, please understand that 5 or 6 years since then.
Excuse me, because...
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, anyway, the Prime Minister, how can I say, announced that he visits the Yasukuni Shrine to pay the killed soldiers, not to, how can I say, admire the militarism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In order to be very brief, what I do believe has changed, and I do believe here really the financial crisis was a turning point. If before the financial crisis on this type of a conversation, we're going to discuss how to manage globalization, now we are much more discussing how to manage backlash against globalization, which have different forms in different countries. And this is a different conversation. This is at least my reading of this. Secondly, when we talk about, and I very much agree, on the level of protests, they're very different. They're going on different contexts. In a strange way, protests now and how you react as a government to the protests tells you much more about the nature of the regime than simply the fact that people are voting or not voting in certain contexts. But why people on the street is an interesting story, because they don't know where the power is anymore. There was one Bosnian protester who told me the biggest problem for us was in front of which building to protest, because we have too many governments in Bosnia. And this type of a diffusion of power, people have the feeling that they don't know where the power is anymore. Why I'm saying this, and I go to the problem of the analytical conversation. I agree, and the major difference was not that there was not clashing position during the Cold War, but in the Cold War there was one dimension that is not present here anymore, and this was the future. In a certain way, the Soviet and the Americans, it was much more easier for them to agree what's happening on the ground because they have very different reading what it means for the future. From this point of view, this future dimension, the fact that in a certain way you're thinking very much about the future as something that is very different from the present is what I find this is a major problem, and this is why history comes so much back. Everything which is not present these days is not history. Future has really kind of been closed as a political dimension, and honestly speaking, we can blame Marxism for anything, but because of the utopian dimension, Marxism was not a conspiracy theory. Now what is basically, you have all the suspicions that brought Marxism, but because of the dimension of the future, the conspiracy theories are starting to run the world and the explanations of what's going on. And here, of course, I'll go to what Professor Migrignan said. I agree with you. I don't believe that I'm talking about the internal instability of a small states. And from this point of view, Bulgaria is nice, because even when we're a mess, we're a self-contained mess. We are never exporting mess to anybody. I'm talking about internal instability of all players, but not only United States. There is internal kind of instability in all of the countries for different reasons, which very much shape their behavior. And from this point of view, all the countries, even the biggest, they don't know how to tax the rich. They don't know what to do with for immigration. They basically don't know how to position themselves in this type of a global economy, and this is where I do believe that part of the tensions come from.
What Andrew Catchins said about the old rules, or why we need the new rules if we could stick to the old rules, that's quite correct. But how can we do that? The old rules, at least some of them, could not be observed in the situation. They could be observed in a situation where we had forces that could impose that. The UN Security Council or the Non-Proliferation Treaty for Nuclear Energy are discrimination institutions that are built on no equal rights for the participants. In the situation of the second half of the 20th century, they could work because those who had privileges also had the opportunity to protect those privileges, to impose their might, and others agreed with that. And today it's no longer so. Your attempts to impose something lead to the opposite effect, and the agreements that on such reasons we have exactly these rules, they don't really work, or they work less and less. So it would be good to observe the old rules, but somehow in the new system it doesn't work. About the great superpowers, what Dima Suslov said about great powers breaking the rules, yes, it's true, and that's due to the fact that everyone is in the situation of deep misunderstanding, not knowing what to do, and all actions are not of strategic nature, but short-term tactical response to what's happening today. As the result, you get what you get in Ukraine, and you get the Middle East when the American policy looks like madness. I apologize, but there's no other word to describe it. Now about these relations between China, US, and Russia. In my opinion, in the future, it's unavoidable that a certain trilateral balance is going to be set, because each side is actually interested in that. No one, by and large, wants to sign any binding alliances to limit the third angle of this triangle. But in my opinion, it depends largely on the US, unfortunately, because the position that they take right now pushes two other angles of this triangle towards certain behavior aimed at deterrence. And what Mr. Prokhanov said about catastrophe or disaster, I think that the catastrophe that might happen, it will not be a good regulator due to technological opportunities that mankind has. This catastrophe is going to be the final one. We can only hope for some common sense. But you were quite right when you said that today the moods changed after the euphoria that they had 20 years ago, that we were going to resolve everything and deal with everything, and it would only be better. It's the opposite. Everyone is preparing for the worst. And in this sense, yes, this this forecast is working. I think that today we already mentioned several times this issue that non-constructiveness in the policy of main actors is growing. And I have one simple explanation for that, which was not mentioned today for some reason. Countries that set the tone, the rhythm, play the major role in the global development, face in the last decade an ever-growing shortage of resources. Primarily, it's about the US, and we know the budget situation there. It's about the EU and a relative surplus of resources compared with what they had 10 years ago is present in China, but it's still not enough resources. We countries have fewer resources like Russia, so everyone has only a small amount of resources. Let me give you a couple of examples.
Ukraine, for instance. Ukraine finds itself in a disastrous economic situation. The nations which support the incumbent Ukrainian government, the one which came to power in March, should first of all destabilize this country. For instance, if they grant $100 billion of aid, and this is a mandatory condition. I may tell you that as an economist, this was not done. Just the nations which support the Ukrainian government, they grant several, just a couple of $1 billion. So they do least of what they can do. Ebola pandemic, the potential of how it may affect the nations, including the most developed ones, actually would require dozens of $billions in order to somehow restrict its proliferation, and only dozens of millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars are allocated. But again, it is many times less than what is needed in order to somehow cope with the situation. So the World Bank lacks resources for any speeding up of the structural development of the developing nations. Therefore, we are no longer no-nonsense, because the developed affluent nations cannot consider the interests of the elites of the weaker nations, and they cannot bribe those elites. Such a situation, as I see it, has all the tendencies and trends to be exacerbated. And even if this situation does not worsen but stays as it is, still there will be no field for existing without conflicts, and the interests of multiple stakeholders in the world politics would not be taken into consideration. Very briefly, first of all, I think that no one is nostalgic, is missing the period of the Cold War. And just one example about the Cold War, still all the accords and agreements as to the limitation and restriction of the arms and weapons were observed somehow and were fulfilled. So it means that the situation there was regulated and structured, and this is what we should bear in mind. This is not about bringing back the rules of the Cold War. So we have to learn some lessons even out of the bad situation. Whether we need new rules and new laws. We cannot write new rules from scratch. For instance, quite recently, we discussed the 10 principles of Helsinki Accord. So they were absolutely brilliant. And so, for instance, the principles of the UN Charter, they were splendid, but the question is how these principles are enforced, how they are fulfilled. So we should come to terms about what we understand when we speak about the right to self-determination, about the independence, etc. So this is not a matter of new laws or new rules. It would be a very simple task. It would be a piece of cake. But we should provide common understanding of all those principles and rules. My third message is about the ISIS, whether this is a global problem or not. I think that this is a global problem because the leaders of ISIS, they speak about a new world order. They propose their new vision, their new approach to the world order which they would like to set up. And even from that standpoint, this global is of a global nature, and it means that the political we have to find a political resolution to this problem, not a military one. And actually, Andronik has one of the competitive edge because he talked to Condoleezza Rice. But I think that it would be too simple to blame the American foreign policy for everything. It would be too simple. It would be too simple. Unfortunately, the situation is much more sophisticated. Certainly, the United States is responsible for what is going on in the world, but they're not alone. And we may list a lot of cases when certain principles would be violated, and certainly it did not contribute to the strengthening of the stability. And finally, I heard a lot of statements concerning the lack of governance and certain mobilization plans, and I respect you and respect your point of view, but in the very beginning I said that our objective is to listen to all the viewpoints, that we have several options. And for me, as a practitioner, the question is not about the theory, but about the practice. So what is going to happen afterwards? So chaos, totalitarian regimes, mobilization plans, but what's next? Will it bring about, considering the factors mentioned by Mr. Kuzminov, will it bring about better stability, more security of the nations, or it will bring about something different? And this is my point of view. Out of this scenario, I do not see any upcoming positive repercussions and consequences. You may ask me about other scenarios, but other scenarios could be very lightweighted and would not be visionary. But predictability, in my view, in my opinion, would allow us to account for other steps. Well, the military are developing certain mobilization plans. And when I was working in the Security Council, I knew nothing about such plans, and probably I missed something. And just again quoting from Mr. Kremev's memories, I think even those who are not knowledgeable about the military plans would understand that those who are serving in the army, they are realists. So I do think that in the general staff we can find a lot of realists, and therefore they would develop the strategies which would be in full compliance with the long-term interests of the nation. Just a couple of words concerning the international law. I would like to remind you that the main principles of the international law were defined when there was certain balance of forces, balance of powers, and therefore, even during the transition period from the Cold War to the monopole world, etc., those principles were observed. But right now, these principles are interpreted differently, and new principles are adopted. And those principles, even if they are not acknowledged by the majority of the world society, still they do exist. I think that we do not have to write anything from scratch, but we have to get back to the common understanding of the new principles of the international law and different provisions of the international law. It would be very relevant and it would make sense. And concerning what we spoke about, the strategic vision, a lot of new ideas were proposed, and when those ideas were proposed, no one would predict that a Ukrainian crisis would break out. And for instance, a new European architecture had been proposed before the European crisis, but it was received with bitter skepticism by our American and European partners, and this idea actually was quite good. It was several years ago. So speaking about the future, probably we have to start developing a new architecture and not just mock each other when such ideas are proposed. And speaking about the resources, I got your point, Alexander, but even speaking about the limited resources of each of the nations, I don't think that channeling of money or resources to any country, even Ukraine, would save us all, because it would not resolve all the problems there. Because in Ukraine, there are too many facets. And as far as the resources are limited, we should be very lean. We should think about minimizing the spending and make our allocations more efficient.
Just a reflection. I agree when you said that in the old order, there was a sort of vision of future for everybody, if you are capitalist or Marxist. Today, what is the vision for a country? When I live in Western Europe, I heard our vision is what? Human right, transparency, equity, and we saw very quickly the limit of this concept. If I saw, for example, the situation now of Turkey, what is the vision? Human right to help some people, or the interests of the state, like in the vision of Cold War? And I think in the Western country, the vision of human right has, in this moment, absolutely no understanding by the population. The best contradiction you can have in the illustration, for example, in some country in the Western Union who want to bomb Syria 1 year ago, and now who are ready to maybe make some agreement to fight against terrorists. Second remark, I think we must not underestimate the pressure and the change of demographic pressure in Western Europe. I take two very recent examples. I see what's happened, for example, in France when there was the problem in Gaza 3 months ago with many riots, many tension with racism. Of course, now you saw the government see in France and in other countries the population is changing. Other example, more dangerous. We discover, like very naive, that in Syria, many fighters, more and more, are from our own country, and we didn't know what to do after, because there is a completely discussion about, well, if they want to return, what we must do. We must kiss, or we must put on prison. And I think it's a real contradiction for the future in our country of Western Europe, because we underestimate the changing of the demographic situation, and little by little we will see that, and it will be an impact of the order.
Спасибо большое. Я надеюсь, что...
Thank you so much. But despite the fact that we robbed some time from our coffee break, still our session has not crossed the limits of governability and does not result in a systemic failure. Thank you so much.